shingles. And my friend Maria, her son is in rehab again. He is hooked on phonics. So I just wanted to mention that tonight. Next we have Chris Joyner reading the Katrina Diaries.
If anyone's ever read me in the newspaper, you know I tend to go long, so I'm just going to jump right into this because I'm going to talk for a minute. So as a reporter, I talked to a lot of people. It was May 2008, more than 2.5 years since Hurricane Katrina ripped across the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and I was 10 minutes into my interview before I realized I know this guy. White hair, about 70. His face was a road map of capillaries. There was an indentation on one side of his neck where the scruff was a little longer because it's hard to shave there. When I first met him, there was a golf ball-sized swelling where the indentation is now because he had gone outside to smoke during Hurricane Katrina and he had been hit by a flying shingle. The blow had irritated a gland in his neck, causing the swelling. I don't know if the indentation was because of the surgery or the result of some Newtonian backlash on the old man's body. When I first met him, he had spent about 6 months in the Raging Cajun RV park in a FEMA trailer. The storm had wiped him out. Today he was 1,000 yards away in a motel adjacent to the park. Formaldehyde had forced FEMA's hand, and he had been moved to the Quality Inn until the next step could be planned. Nearly 3 years since Hurricane Katrina, and this guy was back in the motel just like all the local refugees had been on August 29, 2005 when the storm came ashore. Like I was that day. For nearly 5 months thereafter. The guy explained he was a captain in the Marine Corps before he retired, an MP. I'm not one of those drug-dealing blacks, he explained, darting a challenging eye in my direction. People don't like to hear that again. Oh yeah, I thought. That's why I didn't use his quotes last time. It was 33 months since the storm hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Slightly less since New Orleans' infrastructure failed and their near miss became a calamity that outstripped anything Mississippi could muster. After thousands of lives lost, millions of lives disrupted, billions of dollars spent, I was standing in the parking lot with a retired Marine cop who had room in his meager life for race hatred. After nearly 3 years, that was when it finally got hard. It got hard because people didn't care anymore. Even some folks on the coast didn't care. This long after a disaster, it's the people in the cracks who are most in the margins. Not just the old man with a small pension and hate in his heart, but also the disabled, the mentally ill, the unemployed, the unemployable, the criminal and the victim, the immigrant, the elderly, the trash. These are the people who find it hard to get through a day in America before Katrina, and they're the ones who were most left out of the recovery. But if they couldn't make it, were we really done? Let me back up. In August 2005, I was a reporter for the Clarion Ledger. Then and now, the largest newspaper in the state of Mississippi. I'd been there for all of 2 months in what should have been my dream job. My assignment was to travel the state and cherry-pick the best stories and write them for my newspaper's audience. My first big hit was a story I'd been working on about the emergence of Chicago street gangs in tiny Mississippi Delta towns. And I'd been so deep in the story, I'd failed to notice a gigantic weather system was bearing down on the state until I was called into my boss's office. It's probably going to miss us, he said, but we need somebody down there, just in case. What happened instead is I spent the next 5 months living and working in Katrina land. Amid the rubble, the FEMA trailers, the constant burning of millions of tons of debris and garbage left behind by the superstorm. After that, I came to the coast regularly for 5 years, reporting and re-reporting on the recovery, the endless quest for normalcy. I recovered the disaster virtually nonstop for the first several weeks. I bluffed my way into a caravan with FEMA Director Michael Brown, glommed onto the New York Times reporter and a confused National Guardsman. I rode a Black Hawk helicopter delivering MREs and ice to small communities cut off from the rest of the world. I also hurt my back. Things go south quickly in a disaster. I hurt my back the second week scaling a small fence to try to get to the hotel pool so I could fill up the reservoir in my toilet. That was when the plumbing was working. A few days later, they told us that flushing was off limits. Katrina had damaged the wastewater infrastructure. The bad thing is they made no other arrangements. The hotel is on a 4-lane urban approach to downtown Gulfport. Now, let me just say there was a small grove of trees out back that thought Katrina was the worst that could happen. It wasn't long before people got mad, me among them. Where's FEMA? The mayor of Pascagoula had frustrated tears in his eyes because people were sleeping in tents on their lawns or in partially collapsed buildings or elementary schools. Everyone on the Gulf Coast cried. From the lady who cleaned your room to the mayor of Biloxi who tried to cover it up by saying it caught him by surprise and he hadn't cried about losing his hometown in weeks. People teared up in the middle of conversation like crying was just another form of punctuation. I went to the beach to interview people about how chock full it was of every conceivable type of junk as far as the eye could see. There was a woman in her 40s sucking on a cigarette, tears streaming down her face. She grew up nearby and was back for the first time since the storm, and she just couldn't absorb it. So, you think people will come back, I asked, kicking at a high-heeled shoe in the sand. There's an oak tree in the Gulf, she replied. It was like we were in a Bergman film, and the sea was made of tears. One morning in East Biloxi, I found a half-dozen middle-aged black men sitting around a card table in front of a house playing poker. It's clear the neighborhood was working class before the storm put a dozen feet of water in everybody's home. Now their homes were overtaken with black mold, and their federal government campers were too small to accommodate guests. The card game moved out into the yard. The game had no joy to it, but that could be because there was a white newspaper reporter hanging around and sucking all the fun out of it by asking about stuff they were trying to avoid. It was not yet noon, but one man stared at me with watery eyes, a half-empty 40-ounce bottle of Colt 45 sitting on the ground between his feet. I told him I was a reporter, but he was convinced I was with FEMA, and he wanted to know why I hadn't gotten him a camper. Why has every damn body got a trailer but me? He's still sleeping in a tent, he said. FEMA says no one's sleeping in a tent. Not anymore. Will you get back to me in 15 days, he asked. FEMA says it gets back to people in 15 days. Fool, his buddy yelled. He told you he's a reporter. Don't you know the difference between a reporter and a FEMA? I noticed most of the men were drinking. In September, the month following the storm, alcohol taxes in the state were up $1 million over the same month the prior year. Wow. In October, they were up $2 million. Everybody here believes America's forgotten Mississippi. I'm sick about hearing about New Orleans, they say. They point to 30 miles of coastline where homes, churches, schools, and businesses were demolished by the storm 5 or 6 blocks deep. Katrina, in a drunken, crying rage, devastated their lives. And America forgot, they say. But that's not why they drink. They drink because they know America loved New Orleans and never cared for them in the first place. At best, the Mississippi Gulf Coast was a cheap whore with their tacky casinos and artificial beaches. New Orleans, at least, was an expensive one. I wrote about how Katrina hurt poor people, and in a meeting at the paper, an editor criticized the story because they were poor before the storm. I don't care about them. Welcome to America, I said. Drink up. Everybody knows the sound of a raspy Katrina cough. People believe it's in the air, thick with dust and asbestos, mildew and mold. Every time I go to Waveland, which is a small town on the coast, my car's engine light goes on. The mechanic says it's a problem with the oxygen sensor. Once I get out of the Gulf Coast, the light goes off. But it's not just the cough. Michael Tiller, a 55-year-old, sometimes carpenter, dragged a comb through his long blonde hair, pulling out hanks of it. That and his sallow complexion and bad skin speak of poor nutrition. Before Katrina ruined his rental house in Biloxi, Tiller used to rely on the local soup kitchen for a hot meal. Now Katrina's put rich people in the soup line, he joked. I'm sick too. I can feel it. I can see it in the mold gathering in the ceiling of my hotel room. Nothing I eat down here agrees with me, and I flush hot and cold throughout the day. By the end of the week, I ate with the flu and nurse a tight cough. Big traumatic events like hurricanes are hard on the unhealthy. Sometimes the storm can kill, not with wind and water, but by sneaking in through the back door. In the days following sick, drunken, manic Katrina, I flew out to a rural area on a helicopter with some National Guardsmen. The helicopter landed in a front yard, and local residents came riding in on four-wheelers, clutching Ziploc bags filled with empty prescription drug bottles. You see, Katrina came at a bad time. The storm hit at the end of the month when many poor people were waiting on their checks, TANF, disability. They can only refill their prescriptions when they get their checks, which they didn't. So they showed up and brought their ailments: hypertension, diabetes, cancer. Some were on as many as a dozen prescription medications. The well-meaning guardsmen weren't pharmacists. All they could do was take names and promise to do their best. I don't know what happened to them all. Likely some of them didn't make it, but I can't prove it, and they won't show up in the official death count. Before sick, drunk, crying Katrina came to town, the old and poor shivered and suffered alone. MSNBC had no crew in Socher, Mississippi, to report on the plight of a 300-pound woman suffering from a combination of heart disease and crushing poverty. But then a hurricane took her house away. Maybe Katrina isn't drunk or sick. Instead, maybe she's the wind that blows away the veil, even if for a moment. 2.5 years after the storm, I was sent down to gauge the recovery. FEMA was shutting down the trailer parks, symbolic of their greatest success and worst failure. At a time, there were more than 30,000 people still living in the 21-foot campers, and FEMA's goal was to have them out by the end of the year. No one will be homeless, the head of the FEMA mission said to me with confidence. This seemed like a low bar, but it was a metric. While on the coast, I visited some of the parks slated for closure and got a hint of who Katrina's real losers were. A man from Puerto Rico occupied the first trailer. Actually, he's from Pascagoula, in the same way I was from Jackson. He worked for the defense contractor Northrop Grumman and was living in an apartment here before Katrina wiped it out. I surmised he wasn't working in missile defense. His English was limited, and so was my Spanish. But basically, he said he doesn't make enough to pay the $700 deposit and $700 upfront rent plus deposits on utilities to get a place in Pascagoula. He illustrated this by pointing to figures he jotted down on a scrap of paper while talking to his English-only FEMA caseworker. The man who spoke less English answered the next trailer door. I asked if he was okay and if FEMA was helping him relocate. He shrugged and he pointed to his head. A deaf man dressed in dirty long johns answered the third trailer knock. From a communications standpoint, my luck only seemed to be getting worse. We passed my reporter's notebook back and forth for half an hour as I tried to figure out his situation. He worked for the city in maintenance. Like everyone else in the park, he doesn't know how he can afford rent to jump from $350 a month for a one-bedroom apartment to $600 for a studio. I write on my pad, "Your smoke detectors are beeping. They need batteries." He shrugged and pointed to a secondary detector he purchased himself. In a return note, he tells me the smoke detectors in the trailer never work, batteries or not, and the beeping doesn't bother him. While he's writing, I notice he's heating his camper by setting his oven to broil and opening the oven door. "Does your heat not work?" I write, and point. And he writes, "When AC heat burned last night." I nod and accept the poem. The final trailer I visit is the home of a woman and her fiancé. Her name's Marcy, and she appears to be between the ages of 40 and 55. He's teary, and he looks like a 50-something 19-year-old. He grasps a tall boy in one hand and a homemade cigarette in the other, and he punctuates every sentence with the F word. "Don't curse," she says as I take a seat. She has symptoms consistent with Parkinson's disease and lives on disability. He lives on her. They have lived in the trailer since she moved out of the church shelter in November 2005. Now the good times of living in a formaldehyde box are coming to an end, and neither know what they're going to do. Like unfortunate women throughout the century, she's looking to Terry to take care of it. Terry is lucky to work 5 hours a week doing odd jobs he can't fully describe for a guy he declines to name. The trailer bears the signs of a 2.5-year camping trip taken by people who don't camp. Crap is piled in every corner, and the television is tuned to, I do not kid, to Mama's Family. I think some cosmic force beams Mama's Family down on this trailer park 24 hours a day. I ask what they will do when this trailer park winks out of existence in 2 months. Terry says the F word, and Marcy says she doesn't know. Her hands shake constantly, and she says she's been sick most of the time she stayed in the trailer. Neither knows how they can afford to live on what they bring in as a couple. How can he find work if he doesn't know where he's going to live, she defends. I say I'm going to return with a photographer the next day, and would they be in a picture? She protests that she looks terrible. That's okay, I say. You got 12 hours until I come back. She laughs and lightly taps my knee. Did you hear him? She says to Terry. And then I realize what I've done. I've acknowledged she looks terrible in front of her fiancé. As hard as it is for me to accept, I've made her situation worse. And I've carted away another shred of her dignity. She mentions her birthday's coming up. That's something to look forward to. It's my birthday and I don't know where I'm going to live, she says. Brightening, she says, but I do know one thing. I have a mix for blueberry muffins, and I'm going to have blueberry muffins for my birthday. She motions to Terry. He's going to make them. Maybe he will. Maybe they'll bounce out of this trailer park and into an apartment after all. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. The poor and unfortunate were poor and unfortunate before Katrina cast her eye upon them. Our care for them was fleeting and has fled. Now there's only the rough caress of FEMA. After leaving the park, I stopped at Aunt Jenny's Catfish House for dinner. This was the last place I ate before the storm rushed ashore on August 29th, 2005. They really only have one meal, catfish and shrimp. I had it again as an uncommon January thunderstorm raged outside. It gave me an involuntary shiver to look out the window of that restaurant and see the Gulf storm blow ashore. It was like someone walking over my grave.
Thrilled tonight to have two of my piano students here, Sue